What's up, everybody? It's your favorite president's favorite nerd, and today we are going to be talking about the Lincoln Memorial diorama that I did for a Transformers collection recently. Now, this video is comprised of 3 videos that I did for the Patreon. I do those monthly, one a month at the $5 level, and they kind of give you the how-to, step-by-step kind of process. That's not what today's video is going to be about. Today's video is more of an overview. So, just to kind of touch on the things that we do, a lot of times my wife and I sit down to kind of start an idea, and we use some graph paper and we start mapping out how things would work, finding the certain props like the Lincoln Memorial piece there and how they would integrate, how much space are they going to take. Like, a lot of logistics are worked out here. And to be honest, I've been doing this for years now. I'm still learning about the importance of logistics. Even with some of the last couple ones I've done, I've had to kind of rethink, recalibrate how I approach a project, because a lot of times you start with something and it all fits, but then you put it in and you don't take certain things into account. You don't take, the bulk of the figure, how it looks in front of another figure, what kind of possibilities that the shelf is going to allow you for things like posing or accessories, et cetera, or growth and expansion, right? Which is kind of something that we always have to be taking into account because we run out of space, the vibes. And I'm still learning. So with this one, we sat down with graph paper and still it didn't end up kind of doing everything it needed to do in the end. But we'll talk about that as we get to the end. But I will say, I think this was one of the more painless things. Like the videos that I post up on Patreon, sometimes my wife and I just get into flat out arguments about, how something should look or how it should go. My wife is very much concerned with sort of the aesthetics of the diorama, right? Which I get, and I love her for it. And I am very much concerned with how the diorama is going to display the figures, because the point of the diorama is to display the figures, not to be beautiful in and of itself. If you can make it beautiful in and of itself and display the figures, well, then now you've hit the jackpot. But it's challenging. So it takes a planning process. It takes some frustration sometimes. It takes some blood. It takes some sweat. It takes some tears. But we usually end up somewhere in the middle. We both end up making sacrifices. So this was the end of the build, and then we're testing it with the figures. And the one thing that we didn't take into account there was lighting, but we'll get back to that later. Now, I needed to get these columns, and Chris Pinkerton of Crashbox Customs, he has a 3D printer, and he actually printed them off for me. So he did that. In the videos, I always go through all of the kind of tools and stuff that you'll need, to kind of do what I'm doing if you want to kind of follow along at home in the step-by-step process. So now we're moving into kind of the carving, and this thankfully didn't take a whole lot of carving. It was a lot of brickwork, and then the same type of brickwork or block work, I guess, on the floor of the diorama, but it didn't take a whole lot. Some of the stuff that I've done since then has taken a metric ton of carving. In hindsight, this one wasn't too bad. So don't worry, I make up for it in regards to the workload on the paint, which was really a lot of work. But all the carving here I did, I think, in an afternoon with a scalpel and a pen. And I think I had some reviews to get done in the morning, and then my kid had a basketball game that afternoon. So I only had a couple hours, but I was able to knock it out. It didn't take much time at all. And a lot of the process here, there's multiple videos online where you can find them just doing the same thing that they did for the most part. But carving is grueling sometimes, and especially stuff like this where I had to try to get it to line up and make the seams fit appropriately, and working my way kind of around that in terms of making the diorama look believable and not look like pieces of foam, because that's one of the bigger problems and challenges that I face is making it, sometimes I use the top of a applesauce, and But the key is to make it not look like the top of an applesauce. So it's the same with the foam. And when you have to kind of molly some of them up together, then it creates a bit of a problem. So once again, this is just me going through the supplies. I go through every name brand and every kind of color that I use and how I use them and every piece of material, just so people have a kind of basic idea of of what I'm doing. I've really been trying to utilize the airbrush more, so that's what that's covering, and we'll get into that a bit later. But this is the painting process. My wife, she really enjoys laying flats, like the flat colors here. But I'm doing these. She must have been busy, but like we're finishing up one now for a Star Wars shelf, and she did all the flats, 100% all the flats, and all I had to do was, the dry brushing, the washing, the airbrushing, the shading, the highlighting, the kind of not stenciling, I forget what it's called, stackling. The main, no, but it was nice. We have a good kind of routine. So this was a big trial and error bit right here. The main thing that we were trying to do here was create a marble effect. And we tried it a bunch of different ways, and we show them all because some of them are more successful than others. But it was a process, and this is kind of the most haphazard part of it, this step right here. But this was a very labor-intensive thing once we got into really getting the marbling done right. And I'm actually putting this video together prior to putting the Patreon video together for this because, well, it's a long story, but the Patreon video releases next week, and I can't wait for those folks to see how I did the marbling and what their kind of thoughts are on it, because I think it did end up looking good. But even to this day, I'm not sure it was worth the cost of doing business. I also have a really bad luck and streak and history of putting a lot of work into something, and then somehow, some way, you can never see it. So I did all this, and then it goes on the top shelf, and only the really tall people that come to my house get to really enjoy it. I did something very similar with my X-Mansion for my Marvel Legends X-Men shelf, where I just completely carved the floorboards for the home. I made it all like wood flooring and painstakingly put knots and lines and all that to make the wood look believable, so to speak. And then I put it in, and I'm like, I'm never going to see it. Only Chris Pickerton is going to see it, So it's just my luck. That's just the luck of the draw. But this took forever, and I didn't marble the sidewalls or the back wall. I just did the kind of floors, and it took forever. If you saw that just a moment ago, I use my nail usually to like thin paint out. It's like something that I started doing and developed when I was painting 40K stuff all the time. But there's one finished. And good grief, like even thinking about it now is like making me anxious, because it was just so repetitive, and I hate repetitive work. It's nauseating to me. I need to be in a place where I can kind of consistently do things differently, if that makes sense. So I went with a sponge technique for like the backgrounds and stuff, because it doesn't need to look the same way as the marble floors. And this is just a matter of creating layers, different tones, different colors. I don't think I would do it this way now. Like I've learned a different technique that we'll maybe talk about one day. But it's just a matter of trial and error. And then this bag thing, my wife came up with this whole idea of like splattering it with this white paint on a plastic bag. Worked like a champ. It's just a matter of trying different things, and we go into a lot more detail on that on the Patreon. But once again, my goal here is to provide realistic environments for the Transformers to be in, that show off the Earth, that they're on, not Cybertron, and the scale and how large they are. So the moment that you see the memorial, you think to yourself, like, okay, I've been in the Lincoln Memorial, maybe, and I have an idea for how big that statue is. So these things are huge if they're standing next to it, and that's kind of the key. I'm not personally a big fan of Cybertronian dioramas, like the purple walls and orange walls. It's just my preference. I've seen some look great, don't get me wrong. Just for my preference, I'm not a fan. I like the more earth environments. I think it grounds them somehow, and in a way, I feel like it makes them less cartoony, and especially, when it comes to Masterpiece, everything's moving much more towards a cartoony element. I think it's even more important to have the more realistic looking environments to put them in. And that's been my whole approach with this stuff. So there it is. I did this obviously when I had the old light system in, which is part of a problem that we'll get into here shortly. But, I was pretty happy with this. Like, it's not a lot of flair. It's simple, but the objective of this particular diorama is to display an awful lot of figures, more figures than I prefer to have on one shelf. So I needed the open space. And this was my first layout that I tried. I'll show you my current layout here in a second, and I think you'll agree, I hope you agree, that it ends up looking a lot better than this. But this was my first layout, and just kind of wrapping my mind around it. This is when I wasn't going to have Shockwave on it, which I broke this diorama up and made this one much better, moved Starscream over, moved Shockwave over, and I'm much happier with it now, which we will get into here. And there it is, kind of populated, and I'm pretty happy with it overall, honestly. Like, there's a couple issues that I have with it. So I didn't have these lights in it, obviously, when I was working on it, and had I had these lights, I probably would have set it up in a way where I would have moved some of the bugs and reflector back a bit to be more in the light. I am thinking about making some changes to it. I am thinking about looking for a Lincoln Memorial chair without Lincoln in it, so that I could put Shockwave in that chair and then have him flanked by Thundercracker, Skywarp, get rid of Sunstorm, and then move some of these other guys up a bit. But overall, this I'm happy with. It's dynamic. It shows them at different tiers. It allows you to really see most of the characters pretty well. A lot of the poses aren't stagnant. There's movement. There's dynamic posing. There's, one of my keys to all of this madness is breaking up the uniformity. Allowing things to have variation, both in furniture, in poses, in dioramas, etc. So overall, I'm happy with how this one turned out. And next month, starting on Patreon, is Lookout Mountain, which is one of my favorite dioramas so far. So be on the lookout. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.